The rain was hammering my cabin roof when the knock came. I almost didn't answer it. I'd been sitting in the same chair for 3 hours. Same leather chair I bought 40 years ago when Helen and I first moved up here into the Colorado mountains. The whiskey in my glass had gone warm. I hadn't touched it. Outside, the wind was tearing through the pines like it had somewhere to be. Inside, I had nowhere to be and hadn't for a long time. My name is Leonard Greer. I'm 64 years old, retired contractor. I've been living alone in this cabin since my son Carl disappeared on a ski trip to Vail 4 years ago. 1,461 days. I know the number because I counted them. The FBI searched for months. They found one of his poles lodged in a crevasse near the backside of the mountain. His jacket half buried in snow. No body. They never found a body. After 2 years of searching, they declared him legally dead. I fought it. Spent what was left of my savings on lawyers and private investigators who promised leads and delivered nothing. But the law doesn't care about a father's instinct. The law cares about paperwork and timelines and moving on. My daughter Diana moved on quickly enough. 6 months after the declaration, she and her husband Arnold were already selling Carl's house in Denver. The house Carl had been so proud of, the one with the view of the Rockies he'd worked 10 years to afford. They collected $1.5 million from his life insurance policy. Arnold took over what remained of Carl's tech company, and Diana started keeping Gloria away from me. My granddaughter was 4 years old when Carl vanished. Now she was 8, and I saw her maybe twice a year if Diana was in a generous mood. The excuse was always the same: Grandpa's not in a good place. It's not healthy for her. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a bitter old man who couldn't accept that sometimes the mountains take people and don't give them back. Helen would have told me to let it go. She'd have put her hand on my shoulder, the way she always did, and said that holding on to pain doesn't honor the dead. But Helen had been gone 3 years. Cancer. She went a year after Carl disappeared, and since then I'd been up here alone, teaching myself how to live with ghosts. The knock came so suddenly, I nearly knocked the whiskey off the armrest. Nobody came up my road. The trail to the cabin was overgrown and barely passable in dry weather. In a storm like this, it was close to impassable. I hadn't had a visitor in months. I pushed out of the chair, knees aching, and looked through the distorted glass of the door, a figure on the porch. Tall, broad-shouldered, rain sheeting off what looked like an expensive coat. Some irrational part of my brain whispered what it always whispered in weak moments. That it might be Carl, that he'd somehow found his way home through the dark. I'd learned to silence that voice. It led nowhere good. I opened the door. The man standing there was not my son, but I knew that face. Even after 15 years, I knew it, my younger brother Bernard. 62 years old and looking like the rain had soaked straight through to his bones. His gray hair was plastered flat. Water dripped from his coat onto my welcome mat. Behind him in the driveway sat a dark Mercedes I hadn't heard pull up over the noise of the storm. "Thomas," he said, then caught himself. "Leonard." "Sorry, you've got some nerve," I said. I moved to close the door. His hand shot out and stopped it. "Get in the car," he said. "I know where Carl is." I stood there with my hand on the door and the rain blowing sideways across the porch and the whole world tilting under my feet. "What did you just say?" "Carl is alive." He looked at me, and I saw something in his face I had never associated with Bernard in my entire life. Desperation. Real desperation, not the performed kind. "And if we don't move in the next few hours, he might not stay that way." I should have slammed the door. Should have told him to get off my property and not come back. Bernard was the reason I'd spent 15 holidays eating alone. When our father died, Bernard had maneuvered me out of the family construction business, while I was busy raising Carl and building my own life. He'd bought my share for a fraction of what it was worth. Smiled the whole time. When I told him we were done, he didn't argue. He just left, and he stayed gone through Helen's funeral, through Carl's wedding, through Gloria's birth, through all of it. Bernard had always been capable of a lot of things, but he'd never been a liar, not about things that mattered. "You've got 60 seconds, I said. Talk." He glanced back at the Mercedes. "I'll explain in the car." "We need to go now, Leonard. Every minute we're standing here is a minute they have to move him." "Move him where?" "Carl has been held in a private care facility outside Denver for 4 years. He's listed under a false name. He's being kept sedated, and the man behind it is Arnold Voss." The rain seemed to get louder, or maybe everything else just went quiet. "Arnold?" I said. "Arnold and Diana?" I grabbed my coat off the hook. Didn't lock up behind me. If Bernard was telling the truth, nothing in that cabin mattered anymore. If he was lying, nothing did either. The Mercedes was warm inside, leather seats, the smell of coffee and something faintly like cedar. Bernard had done well for himself apparently even after the construction business collapsed. I remembered reading about it years ago. Lawsuits, bankruptcy. His name dragged through the local papers. Part of me had felt vindicated at the time. Most of me had just felt tired. He pulled out of my driveway faster than the road allowed and pointed us south toward Denver. The windshield wipers worked hard against the downpour. We drove without talking for a few minutes. I let the silence sit there just long enough to make clear I wasn't going to make this easy for him. Talk, I said. All of it. Bernard kept his eyes on the road. After the business went under, I hit bottom, lost the house, lost the marriage. I was living in a one-bedroom in Pueblo doing security work. Then one afternoon, I helped a woman track down an ex-husband who'd skipped out on child support payments. She paid me $200, and I realized I was good at finding people who didn't want to be found. Took some courses, got my PI license, built a client base over a few years. I'm not interested in your redemption story, I said. Get to Carl. I'm getting there. He took the on-ramp onto the highway heading north. 2 years ago, I was watching the evening news. They did a piece on a charity gala in Denver. Arnold Voss was on screen accepting some civic award. Diana was beside him. And right after that segment, the same broadcast ran a story about avalanche victims in cold cases. Carl's disappearance came up. They showed his photo. He paused. I recognized Arnold. Years back, when I still had the construction business, I'd crossed paths with him during a bid on a commercial development project. I didn't get the contract, but I remembered Arnold because there were rumors about him even then. Kickbacks, offshore accounts. The kind of man who builds everything on a foundation nobody's allowed to inspect. So you started looking into him. Just curiosity at first, but the deeper I went, the worse it got. Bernard reached into the center console and pulled out a thick envelope, set it on my lap. Open it. Inside were bank statements, printed emails, photographs. I held them up toward the window where the passing highway lights gave me just enough to read by. Account statements from shell corporations registered in Panama, wire transfers going back 5 years, all originating from Carl's company. Amounts that started modest and grew bolder over time, the way financial crimes always do once the criminal realizes nobody is watching. Arnold got himself hired as COO of Carl's company about 6 years ago, Bernard said, before he ever started dating Diana. He targeted her specifically because she was CFO. She had full access to the accounts, the contracts, the vendor relationships, everything. He used her to build the architecture of the fraud from the inside. I looked at a printed email, Carl's address in the sender field. The subject line, audit discrepancies, urgent. The date was 3 days before he disappeared. I read it. Carl had found irregularities across multiple vendor accounts, fabricated contracts, payments to companies that didn't exist. He was demanding an emergency meeting. He was threatening to bring in external auditors and contact the SEC. He figured it out, I said. He figured it out, and Arnold couldn't let that go anywhere. I set the papers down on my knee. Outside, the rain was starting to thin. So he staged the accident. Paid someone to plant the ski pole and the jacket in the right places. The FBI found exactly what they were supposed to find. But here's the thing about making someone disappear in the mountains without a body. You can never be completely certain. Bernard glanced at me. Arnold needed certainty. So instead of killing Carl, he did something else. He picked up his phone from the cup holder and handed it to me. On the screen was a photograph. A man in a wheelchair, sitting by a window in what looked like a care facility common room, thinner than I remembered, longer hair, a beard he never would have grown by choice. His hands rested in his lap like they belonged to someone else. His eyes were fixed on a TV across the room. I knew that face. I had known that face for 36 years. Something cracked open in the middle of my chest. Where is this? I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. A private neurological care facility on the outskirts of Denver. Carl is registered there under the name Edward Walsh. Admitted 4 years ago following a hiking accident. No family listed. No prior medical records anywhere in the country because there aren't any. His bills are paid through a trust administered by a law firm that traces back through 3 layers of corporate structure to Arnold Voss. I stared at the photograph, at my son sitting in that chair like a man who'd forgotten he ever had a life outside that room. The staff don't know, Bernard said. They're not in on it. They think he's a genuine brain injury patient. But whoever's managing his prescriptions has been keeping him on a cocktail of antipsychotics and sedatives heavy enough to make sure he never gets lucid enough to ask the right questions or try to leave. Diana knew, I said. It wasn't a question. Bernard was quiet for a moment. Diana knew he was alive. Arnold had too much on her by then. She was 5 years deep into the embezzlement. He used that as leverage, kept her in line. I thought about the memorial service. Diana standing next to me in that church, crying, holding my hand, looking me in the eye and saying she was so sorry, and then 6 months later signing paperwork to collect $1.5 million while Carl sat in a room 60 miles away, medicated into oblivion, unable to remember his daughter's name. "There's one more thing you need to know," Bernard said. "I looked at him about a year before Carl disappeared. He came to you with concerns about Arnold. About some financial decisions Arnold was pushing. You talked him through it, told him Arnold was solid, that he was reading too much into it." I remembered exactly. "I vouched for Arnold," I said. "You vouched for Arnold." I turned back to the window. The highway lights slid past in the wet dark. I'd liked Arnold. He was easy to be around, easy to trust, the kind of man who made you feel like your judgment was good just for knowing him. Carl had come to me uncertain, and I'd sent him back reassured. I'd walked my son straight toward the thing that was going to destroy him. "Leonard," Bernard said quietly, "you couldn't have known." "No," I said, "but I should have listened to him." We drove the rest of the way in silence. The facility was on the southwestern edge of Denver, tucked into a residential area behind a row of mature cottonwoods that hid it from the main road. From the outside, it looked like a boutique hotel someone had converted into a medical building. Modern architecture, lots of glass, well-maintained grounds. The kind of place where the price tag was high enough that nobody asked too many questions. Bernard parked in the visitor lot and killed the engine. The rain had stopped somewhere on the last stretch of highway. The parking lot was quiet, a few cars, security lights that lit the entrance without being aggressive about it. "Visiting hours end in 40 minutes, Bernard said. "Here's how this goes. We're Edward Walsh's brothers. You're the older one. We tracked him down through one of those DNA ancestry websites after years of searching. I have forged authorization documents from the trust administrator. The receptionist will check them and wave us through because the paperwork is good and because nobody expects someone to walk in off the street with a cover story this specific. And if it doesn't work, then we figure something else out. But it's going to work." He reached into the back seat and pulled out a folder. "There's one more layer you need to know before we go in. I've been working with an FBI agent named Frances Aldridge for 6 months. Major financial crimes. I've been feeding her the evidence piece by piece, letting her build the federal case properly, so it holds up in court. She has warrants ready. Her team is staged 2 blocks from here. The moment we confirm Carl is inside and make contact, I send her one text, and this place is surrounded inside 10 minutes. I looked at him. "You've been running this for 6 months, and you're only telling me now. I needed the evidence solid before I brought you in. If I'd come to you a year ago with half a case, you'd have driven straight to Arnold's house and blown the whole thing." He met my eyes. "I know you, Leonard." He wasn't wrong. "What about Diana?" I said. "Frances has been in quiet contact with her for 3 weeks. Diana knows it's over. She's made her choice. Full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges and supervised access to Gloria going forward." I didn't say anything to that. I didn't have anything to say yet. We went in. The lobby was warm wood paneling and soft lighting, and a young woman at the reception desk who greeted us with the kind of professional smile that comes with training rather than feeling. Bernard did the talking. He was fluid and natural about it, the way a man gets after 8 years of telling stories that have to hold up under pressure. Long lost brothers. DNA ancestry website. Years of searching finally paying off. He slid the authorization papers across the desk. She examined them, taped something. Frowned slightly at her screen. I kept my hands loose at my sides and my face neutral. Then she smiled again. "Of course, Edward should still be in the common room. You'll have about 35 minutes before we ask visitors to wrap up for the evening." She came around the desk. "I'll take you back." The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner underneath something floral they were using to cover it. Through open doorways, I saw other residents. Elderly men and women in wheelchairs. Middle-aged patients staring at televisions. The machinery of lives that had been interrupted and stored. Helen had spent her last weeks in a place not completely unlike this. I had hated every minute of it. The common room was larger than I expected. A dozen or so residents scattered across mismatched furniture. A TV on the far wall running a nature documentary that nobody seemed to be watching. And there, in a wheelchair position near the window with a view of the darkened parking lot, was my son. He was thinner than the photograph had prepared me for. The photograph had been taken from a distance. Up close, I could see how much weight he'd lost. How the clothes they'd put him in hung loose. How his hands sat in his lap with no particular intention behind them. His beard was longer than any version of Carl I had ever known. His eyes were on the TV but not seeing it. Just resting there, pointed at the screen the way a camera points at a wall. I took a step toward him and Bernard's hand caught my arm. "Slowly," he said under his breath, "we're meeting him for the first time. Remember, right? Edward Walsh, not Carl Greer, not my son. A stranger we were hoping to connect with." Bernard pulled 2 chairs close to the wheelchair and sat in one. I took the other. The receptionist had drifted back toward the doorway. giving us privacy the way staff do when they think they're witnessing something sentimental. Edward, Bernard said quietly. My name is Bernard. This is Leonard. We've been looking for you for a long time. Carl's eyes moved from the TV to Bernard's face, slow, like moving through water. There was nothing behind the look, no flicker of recognition, just a kind of chemical stillness that made my stomach turn because I understood now what it meant. They had not broken him. They had simply switched him off. I don't know you, Carl said. His voice was thicker than I remembered. Slower. The voice of a man thinking through fog. I know you don't, Bernard said. We're going to explain everything. I couldn't wait. I leaned forward and took Carl's hand in both of mine. It was limp, warm but uninvested, like shaking hands with someone who'd already left the room. Carl, I said, quiet enough that only he could hear it. It's Dad. I'm right here. Something moved in his face. The smallest shift, like a light trying to come on in a room where the circuit has been cut. His fingers twitched against my palm. Dad, he said. Then the confusion pulled him back. His brow folded. No, they told me I don't have a dad. They said I don't have anyone. They lied to you, I said. They've been lying to you for 4 years, and I'm taking you home. His eyes were wet. He didn't seem to know why. That was when the door to the common room opened, and a man in a white coat walked in fast, his expression already arranged into something that was trying to be authority and landing closer to alarm. Frederick Rowe, Arnold's man on the inside. He was younger than I'd pictured, maybe 43, hair too perfect for this hour of the night. Eyes that moved between us and Carl and the receptionist near the door and back to us, calculating. I wasn't informed we had visitors this evening, he said. Bernard stood up. Bernard didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about my brother. I was learning all over again. He didn't need to. Dr. Rowe, he said. We have authorization from the trust administrator. The receptionist verified our credentials when we came in. We're Edward's brothers. We've been searching for him for years. Rowe's eyes flicked to the receptionist, who gave a small confirming nod. Something shifted in his expression, not relief. Recalculation. I see, he said, and you are Bernard Walsh. This is our brother Leonard. Bernard kept his tone cooperative, the kind of calm that doesn't give a man anything to grab onto. We're not here to cause disruption. We just want to understand Edward's condition and explore whether there are options for his care going forward. His care is being managed appropriately, Rowe said. He moved closer, positioning himself between us and Carl in a way that was probably instinct by now. Any changes to his treatment plan or placement would need to go through the trust administrator and require significant medical review. Of course, Bernard said. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He held up the screen toward Rowe without handing it over. I want to make sure you're aware of something before we go any further. That's Special Agent Frances Aldridge with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. She's been building a case for the past 6 months connected to this facility, to the trust that administers Edward's care, and to the individuals who arranged his admission. She has a warrant. Her team is currently staged approximately 2 blocks from this building. Rowe stared at the phone. What you do in the next 60 seconds, Bernard said, is going to determine whether you're treated as a witness or a defendant. Right now, you still have a choice. In about 8 minutes, you won't. The color left Rowe's face in stages. First the confidence, then the professional neutrality underneath it. What was left was just a man standing in a common room at night, realizing he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation somewhere along the way and couldn't remember exactly when. His hand started moving toward his coat pocket. I wouldn't, Bernard said simply. The hand stopped. Go back to your office, Bernard told him. Sit down. Wait for Agent Aldridge. If you do anything to interfere with us or with this patient before she arrives, I will personally make sure obstruction of justice gets added to every other charge on the list. Are we clear? Rowe left the room, not running. But close to it, the receptionist was staring at us from the doorway, confused and frightened. Bernard crossed to her and spoke quietly, told her there were some irregularities in patient care being looked into, that federal agents were on the way, that the most helpful thing she could do was make sure all residents stayed calm and in their rooms. She nodded and disappeared into the hallway. I had stayed with Carl through all of it. I was still holding his hand. He'd been watching what just happened with more attention than he'd given the TV. The fog was still there, but something underneath it was working, trying to surface. Who was that man? Carl said. Someone who made bad choices, I told him. He's not going to bother you anymore. I got behind the wheelchair and started moving him toward the exit slowly, normally, the way family does when they're taking someone home. We made it to the parking lot before the first federal vehicle turned into the entrance road. Lights running, then another behind it, then 2 more. Frances Aldridge stepped out of the lead car, a sharp-faced woman in her mid-40s in a dark jacket, and came straight to us while her team moved into the building. She looked at Carl, then at me, Leonard Greer. Yes. Your brother told me a lot about you. She turned to Bernard. Roe is in custody, in his office. Went quietly. Good. She looked back at me. We executed simultaneously on Arnold Voss and Diana at their residence 11 minutes ago. Arnold is in custody. Diana surrendered without incident. She paused. Your granddaughter, Gloria, was at the house. She's with a family liaison officer right now. She's fine. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 4 years. Paramedics arrived and began working with Carl, checking vitals, pupil responses, documenting everything. I stood nearby and watched my son submit to the examination with the passive compliance of a man who'd been told what to do by strangers for so long he'd stopped questioning it. Frances took our statements there in the parking lot. She told us Arnold was facing federal charges across kidnapping, fraud, false imprisonment, identity fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence Bernard had assembled over 2 years, combined with Diana's cooperation, was enough to build a case that a first-year prosecutor could win. You bent some laws getting in there tonight, she said to us. The forged documents, specifically. I'll pay whatever fines are appropriate, I said. She looked at me for a moment. I'll note that the subject's father made contact after being led to believe his son was alive by a credible PI source, and that no residents or staff were harmed in any way. She closed her notebook. Let's leave it there. They transported Carl to Denver General. I rode in the ambulance. Bernard followed in the Mercedes. A neurologist named Dr. Patricia Webb met us in the emergency department and spent 2 hours running assessments. She came back to the waiting room where Bernard and I were sitting in plastic chairs drinking bad coffee and said what she'd found. Years of inappropriate medication had left Carl in a suppressed cognitive state, but there was no structural brain damage, no permanent injury. Given proper medical management and time, she expected him to recover most of his function. How much time, I asked. Weeks to months, she said. Everyone responds differently. But his baseline cognition appears intact underneath the pharmacological suppression. That's the important thing. Bernard and I sat in those plastic chairs for another 3 hours before they let us see him. When we finally walked into Carl's room, he was propped up slightly in the hospital bed, an IV line in his arm, monitors beeping softly. His eyes were clearer than they'd been in the common room. Not all the way back, but closer. He watched us come in with something that was starting to look like recognition. I pulled a chair up beside the bed. Hey, Dad, he said. And it was his voice. Not the slurred, slow thing from the wheelchair. His actual voice. I put my hand over his and didn't say anything for a moment. Is Gloria okay? He said. She must be so big now. I kept trying to hold on to her face, but the medication. He stopped. Everything kept going fuzzy. She's safe, I said. She's going to see you soon. And she is big. She's 8 years old, and she's going to lose her mind when she walks through that door. Carl looked at the ceiling. How did you find me? I glanced at Bernard, who was standing in the doorway like a man who wasn't sure he'd been invited all the way into the room yet. Your uncle found you, I said. Carl turned his head toward the doorway. Bernard was still standing there, one hand on the frame, the other at his side. The posture of a man who'd done something real and wasn't sure he was allowed to feel good about it yet. Uncle Bernard, Carl said. I thought you and Dad hadn't spoken in years. We hadn't, Carl said. 15 years, I said. Carl looked between us, and you still came. Bernard crossed the room then. Slowly, he stopped at the foot of the bed and put both hands on the rail. I should have started looking the moment you disappeared. I should have been the first one making calls and pulling records and pushing the FBI to keep the case open. I wasn't. I got there late. He paused. I'm sorry it took me so long. Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You found me. That's the part that matters. Something moved through Bernard's face that I hadn't seen there in a very long time, maybe ever. He nodded once and pulled up the chair on the other side of the bed. The three of us sat together in that hospital room with the monitors beeping and the hallway noise filtering in under the door, and it felt like something that had been broken for a very long time was at least in the same room as all its pieces for the first time. I looked at my brother across my son's bed. He caught the look. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. Not yet. 15 years of silence doesn't dissolve in one night, but it can start to if you let it. Stay, I said, at least until morning. Bernard leaned back in the chair. I've got nowhere to be. 3 weeks later, I drove up into the mountains with Gloria in the passenger seat. She'd been staying with a family friend during the legal proceedings while the courts sorted out custody arrangements and Diana worked through the terms of her cooperation agreement. The FBI had arranged a child therapist who was good with kids. Smart woman, patient. Gloria knew her father was alive. She knew he'd been sick. She knew he was better now and wanted to see her. She held my hand the whole drive up anyway. Carl was sitting on the cabin porch when we pulled in. He was stronger than he'd been in the hospital. The weight was starting to come back. He stood when he heard the truck on the gravel. Gloria saw him through the windshield. She had the door open before I got the truck fully stopped. She crossed the yard at a dead run, and he came down the porch steps to meet her and caught her when she hit him, both arms around her, lifting her off the ground the way he used to when she was small enough to toss in the air. She was crying before she got to him. He was already there. I stayed by the truck. Some moments aren't yours to be in the middle of. You just get to witness them. And that's enough. That's more than enough. Bernard was leaning against the porch rail. He'd driven up from Denver that morning with groceries and a bottle of decent whiskey and the kind of presence that doesn't require explanation anymore. He looked at me from across the yard and I looked back at him and neither of us said a word. Arnold Voss went to trial 14 months after his arrest. The prosecution had everything. Bank records, Shell Corporation filings, the facility's patient records. Dr. Rose's testimony, Diana's full cooperation, the email Carl had sent 3 days before his disappearance. Arnold's attorney filed for a plea agreement twice. The prosecutor declined both times. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict came back on a Tuesday afternoon and Francis Aldridge called me personally to tell me the number 27 years. Carl moved back to Denver eventually, once he was ready. He started a nonprofit focused on wrongful commitments and financial elder abuse. He said if what happened to him could happen, it was happening to others. He was right. In the first year, his organization helped identify 6 cases of improper psychiatric holds connected to financial exploitation. He testified before a state legislative committee about gaps in care facility oversight. He became, slowly and methodically, the thing that Arnold had tried to make sure he'd never become, a problem for the people who thought they could buy their way out of consequences. Gloria visited every other weekend. She and Bernard figured out how to fish off the dock together. Turns out my brother is patient when he wants to be. On a Saturday in late October, I sat on my porch with Carl on one side and Bernard on the other, and Gloria stretched across the steps reading a book. The aspens on the ridge had gone gold. The air had that cold edge that comes in off the Rockies in the fall and reminds you that winter is a real thing that happens to everyone. Carl said, the worst part wasn't being in that place. The worst part was the stretches when I believed there was nobody left who was still looking. He looked at me. But someone was always looking, he said. I didn't answer that. Just watch the light move across the ridge and let it be true. They stole 4 years. I won't pretend that doesn't leave a mark because it does. Some things you don't get back, you just learn to build around the missing pieces and keep going. But if you're out there right now carrying something heavy, something everyone around you has told you to let go of, something the paperwork says is finished, but your gut says isn't, I want you to hear this directly. Your instinct matters. The refusal to accept an easy answer when it feels wrong matters. The people who love you the most are often the ones who keep looking long after the looking stops making sense to anyone else. Don't let anyone call that weakness. I've seen what it brings home.